I've recorded Les Illuminations, the Nocturne and the Britten Serenade for tenor, horn and strings. Les Illuminations is for string orchestra. It's a relatively early work of Britten's, the end of his sort of first period, 1939, written in America. And it's settings of poems by Arthur Rimbaud. It's followed 2 or 3 years later by the Serenade for tenor, horn and strings, which is for string orchestra and obligato horn. Settings of a sort of selection of English poetry, an anthology, essentially. And then, about 10 years later, the Nocturne, which again is for string orchestra and with obligato instruments, several of them, ending with a big romantic string and obligato instrument ensemble. This project had been planned for a long time, but it started out as 6 concerts, the 3 pieces twice at the Salzburg Easter Festival with Simon Rattle and the Berlin Philharmonic. And that was extraordinary, really, to be performing these pieces to an audience that didn't really know them and that was surprised by them and loved them, but said, gosh, this is amazing music, I didn't even know about it. And that was a very inspiring thing to be involved in, and we went on pretty quickly from that to go to Berlin and record them in the Jesus Christus Kirche in Dahlem, which is a famous recording venue where Karajan recorded The Ring. Les Illuminations was written in London, a lot of it. It's full of English words. I mean, some of the ones that Britten set have got English titles, like Being Beauteous. It's also full of English sentence construction. To French people, it reads very strangely. It doesn't seem quite like proper French. If you translate the French word by word back into English, you actually realise that it's something of it is to do with Rimbaud, picking up English diction, English ways of speaking. He was very interested in English at this moment, and Ville, the first big picture, the first big illumination from Les Illuminations, is really a picture of a sort of phantasmagoric, crazy city, which is London for Rimbaud. It's something very different from Paris, something which he actually found attractive, I think. I think Britten was drawn to Rimbaud because of his bohemianism, and obviously because of his homosexuality, although his homosexuality was very much a sort of teenage thing. Rimbaud went off afterwards to become an African colonialist explorer, slightly crazy in that field as well, and a rather cruel and vicious man as an adult. But I think Britten was both drawn to the bohemianism, which he also saw in the circle around the poet W.H. Auden, with whom he was mixing in the 1930s. But I think also in Les Illuminations he's sort of leaving that behind and saying goodbye to it, because I think Britten is in some ways a very controlled artist, and one for whom too much bohemianism and too much craziness was something a little bit threatening. The sort of dirty, nasty side of Rimbaud is something that he found in some senses repulsive. I think that these pieces are, in one sense, very English, but they're also very international. I think the Serenade is perhaps the most achingly English, the piece that comes closest to the sort of pastoral English tradition, but it's also full of a sort of consciousness of corruption and, I suppose, a sense of corruption in a way that isn't often true in the more superficial, charming tradition of English music.
A very little flock shades thrice the ground that it would stalk, whilst the small stripling following them appears a mighty polypheme.
I think the words are very important in Britain, so one shouldn't, in the eternal sort of struggle between words and line, although one should always be aware of line, the words just have to be there in Britain. And he's unusual among composers in setting such fantastic words, in setting almost without exception, the greatest of poems. Britten was very inspired by the horn playing of Dennis Brain in the Serenade, to find all these different ways of horns imitating things or being other instruments or creating extraordinary sonorities. And that reaches a sort of peak in I think in the Nocturne, where in this very, very short, almost page-long song, the horn has to be a mouse, a cricket going whir in the night, an owl, a dog howling. It's almost a sort of virtuoso use of the horn's potentialities, and I think that's something that probably Dennis Brain brought alive for him.
Midnight's bell goes ting, 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 ting. Then dogs do howl, and not a bird does sing but the nightingale. And she cries tweet, 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 tweet.
Lots of recitals this year. It's particularly a recital year, but also quite a lot of Britain. Those 6 concerts I've already done in Salzburg, doing the War Requiem in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. So it's lots of exciting things to look forward to.
Quelle belle